welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly video series where I go through the letters to the editor in my local newspaper, the West Australian, and I criticise the idiots who write in stupid things. So, the first letter is Then and Now, 30th of April 2014. As a working class child of the 1940s and the 1950s, I can say that getting a belting was common in families and institutions. Many children worked at an early age, and some fell asleep at school desks through fatigue and hunger. I hope these matters are put into perspective when reflecting not so much on failings of the past, but how our young are exploited today. What responsibility does the media take for promoting promiscuity, coarse language, and lowered values that affect young people? Pauline Masters, Wembley. I like this letter because I don't actually understand quite what the point is trying to make. Yes, you clearly point out the terrible abuse of children that occurred in the 40s and 50s, particularly amongst working class families. Yes, you also point out the perceived problems with our youth of today, with their comfort with their own sexuality, their use of whichever language they feel like without arbitrary restrictions, and their secular values that are not derived from the Judeo-Christian beliefs. I'm not quite sure whether you're saying that things are worse now or better now, or whether you're just saying things were bad and things are differently bad now. Not sure. But can I just say that thank goodness we don't expect our children to work these days, and we don't send them to school where they fall asleep from fatigue and hunger. So yes, young people have got it better today because they can have sex and swear and don't have to take their morals from the horrible Bible. Ain't that great? Next letter. Savings to be had here, 2nd of May 2014. Rather than attack pensioners, the Abbott government should concentrate on the growing number of Australians claiming the disability support pension, which I believe is worth more than the age pension. Doctor shopping has made it easy, and it's time such claimants were sent to other doctors for a second or third opinion. Many are too young never to work again. PJ Arathun, Beachborough. Yes, so the disability support pension is marginally higher than the age pension. The reason for this is because they are targeted at two different demographics. The disability support pension is primarily aimed at relatively young people who have a disability. The age pension is aimed at relatively old people who are no longer working. The basic idea is that pensioners generally have lower cost of living than disabled people, and therefore the disability support pension is higher than the age pension. That said, it's not a whole lot. It's somewhere in the range of about $300 a week, depending on what your circumstances are. Let's compare that to the average weekly wage here in Western Australia, which is it's around $1,000 a week these days. That's about 3 times as much. So anybody who would rather be on the disability support pension at about $300 a week, rather than working 1 or 1.5 days a week and earning the same amount in a job, given our relatively really low unemployment and the fact that unqualified people can pretty much walk into jobs here in Western Australia earning at about $800 to $900 a week, means that basically the only people who are on the disability support pension are people who cannot work. To try and squeeze them out, and the suggestion that doctor shopping is a thing, I would like to see some evidence for this. It's always been asserted by people who want to reduce the amount of welfare that the state pays. My understanding is the statistics never back it up. So there you go, Mr. Arathun. Next time, may do some research. Next, working day, 2nd of May 2014. Results of an online survey for Nescafe Cafe Menu indicates that more than half of West Australian women who respond were working 16 hours a day. It's a hard day's night, 28th of the 4th. Do these hours include the time spent on the computer looking for and responding to such surveys, messaging on their mobiles and iPads, feeding their Facebook searches, speaking on the phone, and actually having their Nescafe coffee breaks? That sounds more like a hard night's day. Ron Elliott, Palmyra. Okay, so this is the new face of misogyny, which is basically just the old face of misogyny. I'm not entirely surprised that some women in Western Australia are working 16-hour days. We know that people in WA work more hours than the national average. And I would suggest that those 16 hours a day probably include roughly 8 hours a day at paid employment and 8 hours a day caring for children, which anybody with children will tell you is basically a full-time job in itself. And in today's society, much as it has always been, it is basically the woman's job. Very few men, I don't know any men, who would come home from a full-time job and consider themselves to be primarily responsible for their kids ahead of their wife, even if the wife works full-time. And this baseless assertion that, oh yes, they must have been messaging on their mobiles and iPads, because you know what? We all know that women, all they do is talk on the phone all day to their girlfriends and check their makeup. This is just the same old argument that women can't possibly be doing important and meaningful work because they're women. And if you've got anything better to say than that, Ron, I would suggest you continue to write in, and if that's all you've got to say, then you should probably just shut up. Next one. Paying and using, 3rd of May 2014. The clear message from the Commission of Audit report is one of user pays. But wait, if you're a high income earner, you will still pay tax, you will still pay the Medicare levy, and you will still pay the National Disability Insurance Scheme levy, but you won't be allowed to access the Medicare health system. It is really a case of payer can't use. Murray W. Hill solved the point. Yes, so the current Liberal government's Commission of Audit report is suggesting that they move away from universal healthcare for all people and push high income earners essentially to enter a private system only and deny them access to the public system. Superficially, this makes some kind of sense financially, although many people are worried by the erosion of universal healthcare and certainly the setting up of a two-tier system whereby there are public hospitals and private hospitals. We already sort of have that to a degree, but the entrenching of it by denying access to public hospitals to high-income earners will mean that they will funnel their funds much more readily into private hospitals. All that aside, my main issue with your letter is the idea of user pays. I first came into contact with this term during the Howard government years, where they were bandying it about, and essentially it is a nice phrase that sounds fair, that is really just an argument against taxation. The user pays principle is the idea that the person who uses the government service should pay for the government service, which sounds reasonable enough on the surface, except that when you think about it with any degree, you'll realise that this is contrary to the whole basis of taxation. So the primary basis for taxation, and the reason why we levy taxes at all, is essentially the idea that the people in society who have the most money should subsidise those people in society who have the least. That is, those people who can afford to pay should pay for those people who can't afford to pay. And at heart, the idea is that if you are in the top whatever percentage of society of earnings, you will never make back in government services what you pay into the system. And similarly, if you are in the bottom whatever percentage, you will never pay into the system as much as you've taken out. That is the basis of taxation. It's founded on an idea of, well, two ideas. The idea of simple charity and compassion, that those people in society who are the worst off, on some level, we want to help them out. And so those of us who aren't as badly off pay taxes, and those who are best off pay the most taxes to help out those people who are badly off. That's not a particularly controversial thing, unless you're a Tea Partier. The other part of it is that actually there is a pragmatic argument that actually if you want to live in a society that is stable, that is healthy, that has low crime rates, that has, you don't have to see homeless people on the street every time you walk, go for a walk, that's what your taxation pays for. So even if you are a high income earner, there is a pragmatic reasons for paying this taxation. You won't get it back in services from the government, but you will get it back in terms of the stability of the society you live in. And if you're a business owner or an investor or something like that, you'll get it back in terms of quality employees to work in your factories or whatever it is that you run. And so the use of this term user pays I feel is a stealth way of trying to convince people that somehow taxation is a fundamentally unfair approach, when for hundreds of years now it has basically been an agreed upon public good. And so I don't like it, and I think we should stop using it. Last letter. Judges and sentencing, 6th of May 2014. Perhaps if our judicial system meted out sentences that truly reflect community expectations, the government would not have to legislate for minimum sentencing. Judge warns of great injustice, 3rd of the 5th. For too long, judges have given inadequate sentences for extreme violence. My hope is that mandatory sentences will be introduced for these offences. Rehabilitation of offenders should be considered, but public safety must be a sentencing judge's priority. I feel safer when such criminals are behind bars where I don't have to face them. Andrew Gilbert, West Bustleton. And I think this essentially is the argument for greater incarceration in a nutshell. I don't like criminals. Having them out on the street makes me feel unsafe, so lock them up for as long as possible. The problem with this is it doesn't actually work. Locking people up for longer sentences does not make society safer. In fact, to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent the opposite is true. That if we can divert people from jail, if we can get them out and rehabilitated quicker and better, and if we can do things that stop people from being sentenced in the first place, so if we put our resources into other things rather than incarceration, that will actually make you safer in the long run. The problem is it won't make you feel any safer if newspapers like this one are still bandying the same tripe about us being under siege from criminals. The facts have shown that we are living in the safest time in human history, that our societies are incredibly safe, that you are at an incredibly low risk of being violently assaulted by people you don't know, but you would never know that reading these newspapers. The other thing that is that I'm glad that our judicial system does not truly reflect community expectations most of the time, because community expectations are not a good way of running a judicial system. What the mob wants is blood, not justice. And even if it was justice, what the mob wants is often counterproductive to society as a whole. This is why we have law, and this is why we have not just statutory law, so that, yes, the politicians will do their cheap vote-gaining tactics by bringing in things like mandatory sentencing and harsher punishments, but we also have common law, and we have the precedent set by common law, which stretches all the way back to things like the Magna Carta. And these precedents are so strong as to generally override a lot of the legislative concerns. And these things are where the justice that our society has come to over decades, centuries, and even millennia is reflected. And these are the concerns for the well-being of offenders. I know that's a dirty word to say, but that's actually how a just society is built. People have recognised that essentially the courts cannot provide well-being to victims, and so the court's recognition is for the well-being of offenders and for their rehabilitation, because it also recognises that that's how you create safer societies and prevent victims in the future. And so if you truly care about safe societies, mandatory sentencing is a terrible way to go. I mean, the other part that is often overlooked in these kind of discussions is that while the average offender in Western Australia in particular of a violent offence is a young Aboriginal male, the average victim is also a young Aboriginal male, followed by young Aboriginal females. So most of the people who are writing into these letters to the editor, scared about being, demanding mandatory sentencing, terrified of being assaulted, are actually at incredibly low risk. And that mandatory sentencing, we know due to the law of diminishing returns that the actual deterrent effect of these punishments are minuscule. And so bringing in harsher sentencing, mandatory sentencing, will in no way improve your safety, or will improve to such a minuscule amount that it's not worth the money spent. We could better spend our money elsewhere, and that is exactly what we should do. Anyway, that's it for this week. I feel better having had a rant. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you all next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.